forward. Keep forgetting. So generally, I worked at the medical faculty for a very long time, and so of course, I was introduced to the quality of care there, and that it has a lot of measures. And the most important one is, of course, effectiveness and safety. So we want the patients to go home healthy, and we want the patients to be treated right. Obviously, that's absolutely essential. But increasingly, in the recent years, there's more and more data that other aspects, in addition, are important to make sure the quality of care is actually of high standard. And one of them is the equity. So equity means, of course, that patients are brought into as active partners, and how active they are will very, very much depend on the patient, their literacy, and also their willingness to participate. I mean, if you're not conscious, you can't participate in shared decision making. However, what it means is that the approach towards the patient should be one of inclusivity. In order to have equity in patient care, we need, as much as we can possibly can, transparency and informed patients. And everyone who's here in this audience, of course, immediately realized that we can do a lot of this with visualizations. Currently, this shared decisions making is taking place. To help patients make a choice. So every patient that gets the treatment is informed about the treatment. We have very, very good data that this is effective in supplementing counseling. And in order to do shared decision making, patient has to have to get information from the doctor, but ideally also other kind of evidence-based information. The problem that we currently face is, of course, that usually it's verbal information. The doctor is sitting with the patients in a counseling session, and they just talk. In addition to that, the patients get a lot of consent forms that are written materials. And it's important to remember that these written form documents, their goal is to prevent litigation mostly, so that written documents are written in a way that they can uphold in court in case there's a dispute about the medical treatment. So they're not written with the primary focus of being a useful tool for shared decision making or for actually informing their patients, but just to be on a legal safe side. So we have a lot of challenges currently in medical communication. First of all, a big literacy and numeracy mismatch. There's lots and lots of studies that demonstrate, for example, that the consent form are written in a way that you need at least a high school, 12 years of schooling in order to even be able to read them in the first place. And that's the best case scenario. So many of them are written at a very, very high reading level, incomprehensible for many patients, especially many patients that have low literacy, patients that have other primary languages than the one the consent form is written in, and patients of vulnerable groups, for example, that maybe have already preconditions in their healthcare setting that prevents them to be very, very able to understand everything. What we also know is that the information that is given to patients is rapidly forgotten. So most information that is given to patients is not only hard to understand, but also rapidly forgotten by patients. For example, this was a very comprehensive study where they assessed the recall of medical information and the recall of behavior. And they stratified the cohorts that they assessed in order to of their literacy level. And they found that 30% among the a very high proportion of the information is forgotten. And I'm struggling right now because my second monitor is not on, so I'm not really seeing my slides myself properly. I was just trying to give me 1 second to see if I can do something about this. Meanwhile, you can read all the numbers on the slide in much detail. Nope, screen is just not wanting to switch on. Here we go. Now it is. Hmm. And now my other stuff is gone. Ah, yeah, this is really not working well. So 3, 2, 1 should happen. Why is it not? Do you see anything? It's like,
Yes, we see the medical communication challenges slide,
okay.
but it is kind of shifted to the
Yeah, I
left.
know. Okay, so then you see the same fucked up screen that I see, which means I should do something quickly about this and just reshare. It's really weird for me. It's like mixed in. I give up and I go to this. I just jump a few. So what I cannot do now is just easily hop over the some of the slides that I wanted to skip. So you just have to bear with me and ignore this. And now we come to this because I have a lot of data also from my own students and also from other work that really in-depth analyzes the reading level, etc., of websites also. So not only the consent forms are illegible, but we have also data that the websites that are usually informing patients are similarly illegible. So the consequences of material that is not properly understandable to patients and that is not suitable for shared decision making is three things. First of all, a low recall, I already showed you. Second of all, and this is really a big consequence for the quality of care, the low confidence and the low security of patients. So if patients do not feel confident that they understood it, they might be able to guess answers to questions, but they will not have a good feeling about the whole procedure. And the last one, and that's really a big problem, especially in cancer care, is the therapy adherence. It might be different in the US where you pay for your own medication yourself. In Europe, it's generally covered by health insurance, meaning it doesn't really come out of the pockets of the patients. So what happens is that if patients have to go through chemo cycles at home, they don't take the medication if they're not sure how to do it. So they rather just not take it at all. Maybe they dump it, maybe they give it back to the doctors. In many cases, people don't even admit that they didn't take their medication, which means the therapy isn't working and no one really knows why. So therapy adherence is quite a big problem. So we know that patients wish for better consent forms and wish for better shared decision materials. And for example, one of the highest responses was that they would love to have an illustrated pamphlet, meaning some kind of visual aids. And we also know that doctors would like to have such materials, and the reasons they're not using it, what are the obstacles for them to use visual aids, is that looking for good visual aids was very time consuming. So they don't have them ready at hand. So if you don't, in a counseling sessions, if within a 30-second window you don't find the visual aid, you don't have enough time to go keep looking for it, meaning they really are in dire need of visual aids that are ready and available, etc., etc. And now I'm jumping a couple of slides again because I had planned to do this elegantly. um, while you were listening. So this is the reason why in Dresden we had at some point the idea of developing visual treatment plans that would serve several purposes at once. They could be a quick checklist for doctors to know what is about to happen, so they can make sure that they explained everything fully. They can be understanding aid for patients within the counseling session, and they can be taken home for patients to consult later and therefore improve the recall. So what are these visual treatment plans? So we developed timelines that simply explain for a very common therapy regime the different steps that the patient is about to face. And this is an example, an early example. And what you can see here is that you have the different main sections of the cancer care. Then you have where the patient meets a doctor and as an outpatient or in a hospital. You have the kind of bare minimum of the medical process that is taking place for patients, different cycles of chemotherapy, and then infusion of high doses and infusion of autologous stem cell transplant. So the major parts of a treatment are visualized. Now, what we then wanted to do was to make sure that this information is actually adequate for both patients and doctors. So we had a co-design workshops basically with patient boards, and we asked them, what would you like to see in these visual aids, what's missing, what would you like to be added, etc. So we received feedback from them, and we also made observations in patient intake interviews, meaning the team we sat in and we wrote down all the questions that the patients were actually asking to the doctors in order to find out more. It turns out most of them are silent. Most of them don't ask any questions. They kind of just listen in and hope they remember it and then go home. We also asked the medical doctors what they want to see or not see in these visual timelines, and two things were very interesting to me. First of all, they did not want to communicate dates. So if you set a date, it sets an expectation that a treatment will actually start at a given time point or will actually be done at a certain time point. And they were very adverse to committing to that, because sometimes you have to change the schedule based on adverse reactions or based on a bed being available in a hospital. So this kind of flexibility is needed in the plans. And the doctors they're adamant that we have to communicate uncertainties, that we also have maybe an outcome that a certain cycle needs to be repeated, etc. We then designed 3 plans to assess whether the visual timelines were at all useful for anything. The first step was that we were testing whether the visual representations that we chose were actually useful and understandable. The second step was to assess whether the timeline as a timeline was understandable. And the third was a first evaluation in the clinic. So, for example, this is a bit of a grainy version, but this is a photo of what? If you want, you can just type something in the chat, and we can see whether there's any kind of consistency among your answers. What do you think this means? You have a free text answer possibility. Yay, hospital. Exactly. Hospital building. Yeah, exactly. So this is a photograph. In higher resolution, you can actually see the light slightly better. The ambulance, exactly. So with photographs, you have always a problem that, of course, you have additional information in the picture, such as a green tree, etc., that is not relevant. So you need to make sure that it's reduced down. I'm going to skip over the next 3 examples. You can read them up later on. So what we wanted to do is to compare the visual legibility of information that is communicated as pictogram, as comic, or as photograph, as we saw before. And obviously, a photographer will tell you that the photographs are best to represent because they most accurately show what you want to be showing. Most designers tell you that pictograms are most suitable because they reduce the abstraction. They abstract the information to the essential. So these are different kinds of different versions. So we encoded the key terms for the visual timelines with pictogram, comic, or photo. And then we assessed 2 aspects that are generally used in pictogram research. Is it guessable? That's what we just did with a chat. So basically, you have a free text response and you're asked, what could that possibly mean? And the free text is a nightmare for any researcher, but the student did a very good job, made a large syntax of correct words, etc. And then we also assessed whether it's considered suitable. So that's the second measure. So you may be able to not guess that this indicates a hospital, but if someone tells you this is a hospital, in other words, you have a legend, you might say, okay, yeah, that's very useful, I get it, and then you will be able to recognize it again and again in a visual aid. So what are the results of that? How guessable and are the different forms? What you can see here is everything in color coded in blue is that it was guessable for more than 85% of the participants. You can see that for pictograms, this was the case for 6 out of 8, for comics, 5 out of 8, and for photos, for 4 out of 8, meaning pictograms generally seem to be doing better than photos. Photos have this ambiguity slightly. Why 85%? That's the ANSI requirement for using pictograms in the real world. So you have to match that in guessability and transparency in order to use it for a general audience. So what were the problems? And that's really interesting from a visual design point of view. Things that were too simple as pictograms, for example, pills. Pills were just looking like a little round thing. They were not guessable, but they were better guessable as a photo, because in a photo you could still see that it has a certain texture or maybe little imprints so that it actually looks like a pill. The one that wasn't working at all for any representations is infusion therapy, and you can guess why, because even a regular person wouldn't know what an infusion therapy even is. So obviously it's very hard to guess a complicated instrument from any visual representation if you've never seen it before. So what does that mean for us? It means two things. First of all, pictograms in general can be used, but they are best used together with a legend. So we still have to somewhere on a visual aid explain what they actually mean, so people can double check that it's what they're expecting it to be. The next step was then to see whether visual timelines help anyone to understand information better. So that to this end, we had a 2-minute audio information that we based on the information that was given in our hospital by 4 different doctors. So we made a synthesis of this and condensed it down to 2 minutes. So in the 2 minutes, everything that is on this visual aid is actually explained with words. And when we then compared people who only heard the audio, so simulating the setting that we actually have in the consultation, someone tells you something, and we compared that to someone having the visual aid in order to double check the information. So this was the setup of the study. So we had 3 groups, and then we asked if the visual aids are comprehensible and how patients feel with it. So you will see a couple of them that I call text-based, and that doesn't mean that it's not a visualization, but it's a visualization where all the information is explained with text in the right place. So it's a kind of a mixture of text, but arranged in the visual form. So these were the text-based and pictogram visual aids, and then we compared that to no visual aids. So we then scored the response quality, so how many questions are answered correctly, and the highest rate is up here and the lowest rate is down here. So the higher you get, the better you are, and then each of the responses is encoded with a dot, and the mean is shown as a height of the bar. And what we can see is that audio only was comprehensible to our study population. So many questions were correctly answered. But if we use a visual aid, this number goes up by roughly 10%. So that's a pretty large increase. And that's very helpful for us to know that we can increase the comprehension of patients with a visual aid. It's not really surprising, but it's good for us to get precise numbers, because if we want to do a clinical trial where we compare the standard of care to visual aids, we need to have those numbers in order to calculate the study population size that we need. We then showed that the response time was initially slower when participants used visual or text aids, which means they actually did use it. And we know that these patients, the people with visual aids, were not slower in general, because for control questions, they were the same. So we measured the time for control questions as well as for the content questions, and here they were the same speed. What was important for us, really, really important for the hospital setting, is that the confidence that patients were sure that they answered correctly was also increased a lot by using a visual aid. So this means we had, after each question that was a content-related question, we asked the participants to say whether they are sure that they got it right. And this is, of course, important because for equity and shared decision making, we don't want them to guess whether they remember something, but we actually want them to know. And the participants also rated the clarity higher when they had visual aids. So all in all, we were pretty happy with the results, and we wanted to now, of course, make an initial test in the hospital. So in the hospital, we had in the first setting no control groups. So we simply did an evaluation of whether the doctors felt able to use the visual aids and whether the patients felt able to, that it would benefit them at all. And this is a critical first step to show that it's not a hindrance in the counseling session, because if it was, we wouldn't be able to proceed with the randomized trial. So we, of course, had an ethics vote, and we applied this to hematopoietic entities in the TU Dresden. And this was a setup during the outpatient consultation that is done before the chemotherapy is initiated. We asked the doctors to use the visual aids, and we then surveyed both the medical doctor as well as the patients on how that did go. And we then were lucky that some of the patients had a scheduled a next appointment at the hospital, roughly 4 weeks, actually, sometimes also longer, after the initial outpatient consultations, where we could meet them again and talk to them to see how good the recall was. And what we found was that the medical doctors were generally had the impression that the patients understood the visual aids, that the visual aids were useful for the patient visit overall, that it was simple for them to use. And I would like to point out that they were not given an education session. They were simply given the visual aids and were able to use them right away. And for us, it was critical to get that feedback, whether it was clear for all of them at first glance, and it was. So that was very good. And most answered that they would use the visual aid in future. And a small fraction said they do not agree. By now, 2 years later, after we concluded the clinical evaluation, I know that they're all still using it, because they keep asking me for updates in all of the departments. So that means by now they're all used to it. Every single doctor gets this visual aid that joins the team and is super happy, as an assistant doctor especially, who has no clue what's going to happen the next day. They have to suddenly memorize 200 different leukemia versions, etc. So they're super happy to have these, and it's just become general practice in Dresden that these are used for the patient's consultation visit. So the patients also responded that they thought the visual aid was helpful for them during the visit, and also for answering the content question that we then asked it, and they planned to use it at home. So now we also looked at the response quality. So again, we checked how good they were at responding to questions, and with this, they were getting 80% of the questions right. I need to stress again that we did not have a control group in this setting. We need to first had a foundational evaluation in order to see whether they were useful, but that's what's coming next. And then we did the resurvey, and we met 11 patients again. So this is not the same number as before, because not everyone had to come back for an apheresis. And of these 11 patients, 10 said the visual aid had been helpful. They also said that the visual aids was helpful to remember details, because they sometimes go home, have maybe the general impression that they were helpful, but they actually did go back to check details. Visual aids for some of them was also interesting, used to inform relatives. And here I would like to know that the number is not low because they didn't use it, but because they didn't inform relatives. And this was something quite shocking to me that I had not anticipated, that a lot of cancer patients just deal with it by themselves and don't seem to be wanting to tell anyone about it. So that's this low explanation for this rather low number here. And what was again interesting for me to see is that they treasured it. So the patients kept the visual aids, and most of them, when prompted, remembered where it was. So on the hustle, on the fridge, in the map at home, next to the tail of landline, etc., etc. And then the recall information was also good. So after 2 to 6 weeks, as I said, initially we are planning to 4, but sometimes this got delayed. So many of them kept the information level that they had at the survey. So this was that particular patient response quality at the survey and then at the resurvey and for each of the questions. So you can see that most of them go down, but they don't go down to 0. So that's very encouraging. So what we have now ongoing are 3 different aspects. So first of all, what we presented to the patients at the present was a paper-based visualization, which for the current hematopoietic patients, and they're like 60, 70, they all wanted a paper one. So they were adamant that they do not want another app. But in future, we will have more and more digital natives who are actually able to use apps. So we hope that at some point we can progress from a paper-based version to an app or an electronic version, because that would be wonderful, so that we could automate the updates, we could automate the distribution, and actually we could even allow doctors to make maybe minor changes and small changes to personalize the timeline even further. And as a first step towards that, we first wanted to improve the readability and accessibility based on UX principles. So these are the 2 plans. This is the before that I had designed, and then on the side you see the one that the UX designer made and improved. And you will see that the differences are small, but they are noticeable to those using them. For example, each of those steps was indicated with a line going down. So this is now in German, because that was the follow-up study was done in Germany. But you can see that it's very, very precise in knowing which part is indicated with the header, for example. The colors are also slightly changed. So this blue was a bit hard to see on the red, and it was too dark on the most screens, etc. So the fonts were also slightly added, etc. So so the next version was to make sure that the UX changed plan, or the adapted plan, is not worse. So we wanted to make sure that these 2 are comparable in the answering quality. So we redid the same survey. And just to remind you, from audio only to visual aid, we got a step up of 10%. Now, what the Laura showed in her thesis, that with the visual aid to her redesign, she could go up even more, 10% more. So we were expecting that these two timelines would be equally good in communicating the information about cancer, but it turns out the redesign was much better. The bad news was that the interactive version that we started out was not at all helpful, because it was too laborious for people to actually click through the different parts. And I think that kind of echoes a little bit what we actually know from general visualization research, that people don't like clicking, people don't interact enough with visualizations, and are generally a bit too, in quotations, lazy, right? Obviously, this is not laziness, but yeah. this is really not that appreciated among users. And we could confirm that in this study as well. However, we are still like trying to improve that. The work from is currently being considered for the Swiss Whiz Award. So on Friday, we'll hear back whether Laura made it among this list. The other stuff that is obviously ongoing, and that's why we did that pre-studies to get these numbers, to now do a multi-center randomized study. So we need to have a controlled study, and we need to test it in several hospitals in order to really measure the exact effect on comprehension, which will be the primary endpoints. And then we'll have a secondary endpoints with patient-reported experience measured, because we want to know how it actually is for them, because only if patients feel okay with it, they're actually willing to use it. And ideally, if at all possible, we would like to have exploratory endpoints to see after 2 years how many are still alive. Maybe we can still learn something about that, but that will very much depend on the numbers. And with that, I'm going to have to now click through a couple of slides, I think, before I reach well, don't know where that went. Okay, so the acknowledgement is gone. I'm sorry. But yeah, so I say in names, nothing of this would have been possible without the large cohort of the medical doctors at the University Hospital Dresden, who were like willing to test out this wild idea. That was not immediately useful, apparently, to them. Now they're convinced and willing to support this more. I'd also like to mention Julian and Laura and Anna, who were the students involved so far, and we're pushing on to keep going with this. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Helena. This was really interesting and informative.